All right. So this is video number 4 in the series of my presentations between 2022 and 2023. We are now in the year 2023. Woo-hoo, what? So I was able to present this in April of 2023 at PCA, the Popular Culture Association conference that they had in San Antonio, Texas. So this is just a kind of like a brief recap of the presentation I gave there. And we are talking about, yes, we are talking about Mr. Bruce Wayne, the Batman himself. And I'm going to be talking about Batman and Bruce while I'm wearing a Superman t-shirt because I can, and I'm just weird that way. It's I can't make this up. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So if you've been watching the series, like, thank you. If you left any comments, feedbacks, questions, concerns, anything at all, again, pretty sweet, pretty awesome of you to get the slideshow started. And I'm gonna stop sharing and make sure that I shared this correctly. I did hit screen, right? Hit screen. Okay. Uh, so my particular topic was on not only the Caped Crusader and Batman, but asking the question, is Batman an indigenous superhero? Can we consider him an indigenous superhero? Run that off camera. And here we are. This is okay, there we go. So we are talking about that Batman. That's what you were thinking about. So it was created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, which are important that I might bring up at a later time. Bats first appeared in Detective Comics, which is short for DC. I'm sorry, our DC is short for Detective Comics. Everybody might be more familiar with that. It was issue number 27. It was back in 1939. They did create New York to be a fictional Gotham, and he was there to protect them from villains. And he was the billionaire who came to be known as Bruce Wayne. All right, now I know there's like a million Batmans depending on when you grew up. I mean, there's Michael Keaton, there's Val Kilmer, there's George Clooney, there's Christian Bale, all very iconic Batmans, Adam West. So everybody does have probably their own favorites, their own memories attached to Batman. Now, I might say an unpopular opinion here, but I think um, Robert Pattinson was by far my favorite Batman. Yes, my favorite Batman. The 2019 movie that came out by Matt Reeves, The Batman. He was by far my favorite. Not my favorite Bruce Wayne. By any means. A little different, you because it is a year two. It's very possible he's still trying to come to terms with his identity and what identity is going to get him where. Because of course in the story he's supposed to be this, you know, playboy kind of does whatever he wants, devil may care, billionaire. Um, and I think he's going to find that it opens some doors for him come the next, few movies. But right now, he was not my favorite Bruce Wayne, but he was definitely a very good Batman. But that's all I'm going to be sharing about that. So the reason I particularly focused on this film for my project was for a couple of things. The first thing was the casting. Okay. So we have Zoe Kravitz as Catwoman, and why Catwoman was this isn't the first time she's been represented by a black woman. I still thought her portrayal was very significant. It really goes to shows that the producers, the director, the writers, everybody in the casting room was also thinking very critically about what they wanted to portray in this movie. And so it was very color conscious of how they were casting people. And I just absolutely love this 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 photo of Lieutenant Gordon. So we do also have a casting of Jeffrey Wright as Lieutenant Gordon as well. This is the first time that we have seen Lieutenant Gordon um, differently casted from what we were traditionally might be thinking about. So because this movie was so color conscious and very casting conscious of what it was doing, I really thought we can push the envelope just a little bit more, just a little bit further on who are we choosing and why are we choosing them. The second is going to be Martha Wayne. It'll make more sense coming forward into the presentation, but Martha Wayne is another reason that I chose this film. So in the film, okay, should have said there's going to be spoiler alerts. There's going to be some, some trigger warnings here and there because we do it's Batman. It is a very noir, very gothic, very dark comic, much less a movie. So setting that up right now, you're going to hear spoilers if you haven't seen the movie. You're going to also probably see some images as well as hear some things. Um, so if you're very triggered about anything with violence or anything like that, murder, we are going to have to talk about that in here. So Martha Wayne. So in this particular plot, Bruce Batman finds out that his father paid Carmine Falcone or had some type of relationship with him that resulted in a reporter getting killed. And the reason that reporter was getting killed was due to the fact that he found a secret about Martha Wayne. Now, the film, from just a few images and clips, it does look like maybe Martha Wayne might be suffering from some type of like postpartum disorder or maybe another mental illness of a different kind, but it doesn't specify. Like when a film or any type of book does not specify what the issue is, if it's not very clear, then we can kind of infer something different, which is what I'm going to do. Because what if the secret that got this reporter killed about Martha Wayne is not about her mental illness or anything like that, but maybe about her parentage and her lineage? Maybe they find out that she is an Indigenous woman or partly an Indigenous woman. She might be maybe in the Latinx category as well, and that's where my project is pushing the question of is there indigeneity in Batman, particularly this film. Now we have seen other films do this in the past. I'm going to bring up Netflix Wednesday with Jenna Ortega. So the way that they explain, Jenna Ortega's Wednesday Adams in a way that makes sense with the Latinx, besides her dad being named Gomez. They show Goody Adams. And when Goody Adams is kind of like, recounting her story to Wednesday, she runs into a barn that her mom is being trapped in, and the barn is being lit on fire. Now, we do see this woman very clearly. We do see that she is an indigenous native woman because it says the family came from Mexico. There might be some mixed as far as, Latinx, Hispanic, Mexican, things like that. Um, so even though her name is Wednesday Adams, it still shows where she is part of this culture. And so I think more what my project is saying is that we can do it. He can still be named Bruce Wayne. By showing that yes, particularly the mothers, and if you've are familiar with what my dissertation is about, it's all about eugenics and how eugenics has impacted the way we tell stories, has impacted our literatures, and essentially from a book, it's in a comic, it's going to go to a movie, and how it's impacting it that way. So one of the ways that eugenics worked that we'll actually be able to get to talk about a little bit more at the end is it didn't just say we are going to institutionalize or imprison or or kill certain people or sterilize them, we're also going to breed them with certain people. So what happened quite frequently between Florida all the way to South Texas, all the way to you know, California, very important, these destinations, and it's coming up later in the presentation. Uh, is that a lot of indigenous and native women, a lot of Mexican women, a lot of Latinx women were married off to white men for that reason, so that it can start lightening up the race. They can start integrating European features, and so that you can have a European name, as well as maybe some type of wealth or social standing. We have to remember that when many of the folks came over, right, the Spanish brought horses, they did not bring women, which is how much of this occurred. And I am saying that it's quite possible, a little bit of Desiree's baby going on here, that we might find out Martha Wayne's is indigenous. That's particularly where I'm focusing on. So that's another reason, that's another aspect of this particular story on why I'm looking into this one. And again, we went over eugenics a little bit. So Charles Darwin, his Origin of the Species, did say survival of the fittest, you know, evolution takes a very long time, because we're looking for certain features, we're looking for certain traits, we want the best of the best, and it takes a long time to develop these really good features. His cousin, Sir Francis Galton, said, we can speed that up, and we can speed that up by taking certain traits that we consider undesirable outside of the gene pool. These undesirable traits became anything that was not white displaying, white passing, white featuring in any means. So here it differs between how eugenics was dealt with men and how eugenics was dealt with women. We do have the way a majority of American rhetorics does address how it was dealt with men. Anything from lynching to false imprisonment to sterilization to institutionalization, even schizophrenia for a while was used as a diagnosis to kind of let people know if this particular dark-skinned man was into politics. They try to say Martin Luther King was schizophrenic at one point. So there's many different ways in American rhetorics and how we're dealing with it in men. And this project looks on how we're dealing with it in women in the Martha Wayne character. Okay. Another reason too is we're also looking at eugenics. We have the final point, right? We have the pinnacle of what eugenics has left us with, and it is Bruce Wayne into the story, him being Batman. And so what I'm going to try to do with the next part of this presentation is say, how can we take out what eugenics has put into the literatures, into the stories, and find the pieces that we're looking for? Now, this isn't anything new with Batman. For those of you that are, you know, part of Batmania and things like that. This has been done. That's why I said Bob Kane and Bill Finger are important figures that we're going to talk about. This is since Bob Kane and Bill Finger were both of Jewish descent. Bill Finger actually changed his name. It used to be Melvin, but because it was considered a Jewish name, he changed it to Bill. It was back at a time where there was a lot of anti-Semitism in America. You could be fired for looking Jewish. You could be fired for doing anything that reminded anybody of Judaism. So that is why he changed his name. So many have also tried to find this eugenic links between Jewish and saying the same thing. Could bats essentially be Jewish? Now Batman does have a cousin named Katie Kane, and she eventually does become Batgirl at one point into the series, but she was given the name Kane after the creator, Bob, And since Bob was Jewish, they said, well, Katie's also Jewish and it's a cousin on his mother's side. Judaism is passed down through the mother's lineage. So again, these links have been done before. Now, I'm going to take it in a little bit of a different direction that probably nobody's seen yet. So bear with me. I do have to give you quite a bit of back information before we get back to Batman, and that's what we're going to see here. So one of the inspirations for the original comic was Johnson McCulley's Zorro, which came out in 1919. And then eventually it became a film, The Mask of Zorro. It was a favorite of Bob and Bill's, and so this did impact in how the story was created. This has been confirmed by Bob Kane in his biographies and things like that. They saw this movie, they loved this movie, they loved the book, and this is the character. So here we have with Zorro this kind of Hispanic lineage, this Latinx lineage that we're looking at, located in California, which is why I said very we have to be very precise about locations. So we're looking mainly into California. So the story of Zorro is that he went to California. His brother was killed, and now he's become this outlaw trying to right the wrongs of those against his brother and himself. And right around this time, it was post the Mexican War. So California did belong to Mexico at that time. It was still, it was right after that turmoil. And so it was much of the colliding with the new incoming Americans, those people from the gold rush, and the folks that were already there. So this is more of a story about rebellion against colonialism and being colonized in California, specifically. California is often called like the last city of the last state of the West, so to speak. So Zorro comes out. So here we can say, okay, here's this Bruce Wayne. We're kind of like we have to like it's like a Pokemon, right? We have to de-evolutionize it. Like we say, okay, we know how it turns out, but we got to bring it back down. So the first layer is looking at Zorro and looking at this Latinx hero and its influences, and it will come up again. Now, Zorro was influenced by the story of Joaquin Murrieta. And Joaquin Murrieta has much of the same injustices that happened to him. It's often been debated by scholars whether Joaquin Murrieta was a single person or whether he was a combination of several different bandidos in the area. What was also very common in California newspapers specifically was they wouldn't say, three men of Mexican American descent or three Latinx men or Latinos, were shot and killed. They're going to say three Joaquins. And so that was very common, and it's very possible this could be also a literary device. But Joaquin Murrieta, his story is much the same. He had his so in order to dig California in the gold rush, you did have to have a permit. He had his permits taken away. He had his land ceased from him once the permits were stripped. He was beaten in a crowd, so he did get one of his punishments was lashings. His brother was killed, and his it depends. It says his companion, but it could have been his fiance. It could have been his girlfriend. It could have been his wife. Was also gang raped. His brother was lynched. I don't know if I mentioned that. So these were the injustices that Joaquin Murrieta faced in this post-Mexican versus American war that happened in California, and very much rebellion against colonialism. There was a lot of laws that specifically were targeted towards Latinx and Mexican American people, saying like they weren't allowed in certain places, they weren't allowed to own land, they weren't allowed to dig. But these laws did not impact the French or the German the Chinese or anybody else who was flocking to California in order to dig the gold. So here we can see again, we have bats starting there. The first evolution is Zorro in the Hispanic uh, region, or the Hispanic line, which is more Spanish. Don't get me started on that. But Hispanic is a word that comes from the Latin Hispania. It's found a lot in Julius Caesar's diaries, especially when he's writing about the Gallic Wars. So that's the first layer, because it's still, I mean, if you're from Spain, you're European, you just speak Spanish. That's the main difference. So here we have the first layer, and then we have the second layer after that, which is Joaquin Murrieta. Now, usually this is where the research currently lies, anywhere between Zorro and Joaquin Murrieta. There's many scholars that have already done the work on this. What I'm going to look at is a little something different, because the writer of because Joaquin Murrieta, there was a book, The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta. So while we have the historical fact, they did say, like, they kept his head and his general, three-fingered Jack, they had his hand, that kept in the California Museum, which was destroyed around, I think it was like the 1920s, 1930s. There was a big earthquake, and much of that was lost, and that was one of the artifacts. So while we do have the historical Joaquin Murrieta, there was also a book published that was about the life and adventures and what happened with Joaquin Murrieta around that time. And it was written by John Rolling Ridge. This is the first book that was published by an American Indian writer in the English language. It was also published under Ridge's native name, which is Yellowbird. So Ridge was from the Cherokee Nation. Um, and he was like, I mean, he had a major impact as a poet, as a journalist. He was also he made several firsts as a Native person. Like the first Native person to be editor of this newspaper, and then the very first editor of the Sacramento Bee. He was very much involved in politics, like his father and his grandfather, his entire life. He had many, many poems that are still published today that you can look up and read. So what I would like to do, what I would like to do in my presentation, which hasn't been done, is make the connection between Batman and John Rolling Ridge. One, because we've come across the de-evolution, right? So we've gone from European to Hispanic to Mexican, American with Marietta, and now we are getting to the indigenous roots. Because who's the writer? Who got his story out? And much of the debate is not only how much is this the historical Marietta, but how much of this is Ridge's interpretation of the facts, or how much of this is John Rolling life himself. So at the age of 12, John Rolling did witness the assassination, lynching, however you want to look at it, of his father, John Ridge, and his grandfather, Major Ridge. There was a division between the Cherokee nations. There was two fractions: the Ridge fraction, which wanted to assimilate, which wanted to become part of the Union. And they did write up several treaties that you may or may not be familiar with. Now, these treaties did give the American government permission to move the Cherokee Nation from Georgia all the way up to Arkansas, and then what eventually would become parts of Utah. So Ridge and his family were very, very rich. His father had his own farm. They had several different types of animals that they were growing there. It's part of the Cherokee Nation history that they too owned slaves. Ridge was an advocate of keeping, because he wrote quite heavily during the Civil War time, politically, and he was not a fan of Lincoln for that particular reason. He felt getting rid of slavery would impact American society and how much America was making in money. So his father, unfortunately, and grandfather, they counted their riches with how many human beings that they owned. They also saw it as a way of showing that we've assimilated, or that we're very similar to the American Union in that way, for wanting to own slaves. Um, the second the faction that was divided was the Ross faction, and that faction would actually, like, Ridge would deal with many of these for the rest of his life. The Ross fraction wanted to be more indigenous. They did not want to assimilate. They did not want to move. They did want to fight when, excuse me. So they did want to fight against being brought into the American Union and American um, public. They were not in agreement with the treaty that was signed by John and Major Ridge. Um, what the fallout of that was, because they were not on sync. And what happened is the Ridge family sold their property and took their slaves and much of their cattle up to Arkansas, and they went before everybody else, but they had the money and the means to do so. Those that wanted to stay behind, or those did not have the means to move because of poverty, they were forced off their land, which became known as today the Trail of Tears, in which over 8,000 Cherokee people were, they did not make it. They did perish in the Trail of Tears. Um, and that was at least almost half of the Cherokee Nation at that time. So the Ross fraction and many of the others, which who did support the Ridges at the time, did blame them for the Trail of Tears, for signing this treaty that gave the America, because even if they took it to a judge, they would say, well, you made a treaty, you made this. So they were blamed very heavily for it, which is why John and Major Ridge were attacked by the Ross family. And actually, even later into his life, Ridge, John Rolling, would be attacked by another Ross faction member, and it resulted in that man losing his life, and Ridge had to once again flee, which is how he ended up in California. So his mother and his grandmother and the rest of his family, he did have brothers and sisters. They were not harmed in the lynching that took place, but they did witness it, and they did then flee to Arkansas, in the hopes that they would not be assassinated as well. And then since John Rowling was very public about what happened, he felt an injustice about what happened to his father, and nobody wanting to hold him in responsible. He was very outspoken about what had happened, and so he was then sent to school in New England, which is where he studied. He met his wife that way. Um, so he was very much in agreement with his father and grandfather of wanting to assimilate, of wanting to um, be part of this. And much of his politics, he was a diehard Democrat, which at the time wanted to uphold slavery, were very much in support of the Confederate Union. Um, John Rowling wrote about this until the day he died, and yet he creates this character, not creates, but he becomes so fixated with the stories, is that he wanted to sit down and write the story of Joaquin Murrieta, which, like we said, rebels against colonialism, which rebels against assimilation. Um, And it seems a little odd that a man who would spend his entire lifetime supporting something would want to write about a character and a person or persons, depending on the historical facts, that rebel against colonialism and assimilation. So this has led some of Ridge's scholars to hypothesize that John Rolling Ridge was very much Joaquin Murrieta in the sense that he felt the same way as Marietta. He felt this sense of injustice, he felt this sense of rebellion, and this was his way to do it was through writing. Um, as opposed, so there were like the ridge that we see in the journals and the essays, and even some poems are not are not the real Ridge, right? Like that is his persona in order to stay in politics, but his real mission um was to promote the ideas that Joaquin Marietta represented. Um, so I will leave it at that. So here's the origin story of Batman, because I'm going to get back to this, but the origin story of Batman is that he was at the theater with his parents. His parents were robbed, they were shot, which is why Batman does not use guns. And Bruce, at the time, being very young, um, witnessed all this. He was left unharmed, and this is where he kind of made his pact with himself that he was going to get justice for them. And for those Batman diehards, like he has this oath with himself of like what certain things he's gonna do and he's not gonna do. Like he doesn't kill anybody, he doesn't use guns for this very reason. Everything he does, like it's so methodical. He's such a machine because of what happened here. And this is actually a clip from year one. So we see here also the Mark of Zorro. Um, so sometimes they have them like going to the opera or anything like that, but in this particular story, they're actually watching Macaulay's movie of the Mask, or the Mark of Zorro, which is also part of the origin story of Batman and why he decides to, well, not really why he decides to dress like a bat, but why he has this. I think you understand what I'm trying to say. I might just be circling around that. So here it is another way in my presentation that I'm saying, while while we've looked at Edward Zorro, we've looked at Marietta, we have not yet looked at John Ridge and how he compares to Batman. And so the way that he compares to Batman, just A to B, is they both have the death of the father, right? Ridge was very close with his father and with his grandfather Major. And he, if you look at much of his journals and what he wrote in his magazines or when he was an editor, many of his essays, it's a verbatim of what his father and grandfather were already saying and preaching and doing. And Bruce Wayne is very much the same way, especially in this one. For this particular movie, we do see where Bruce wants to uphold his father's charities. He wants to uphold his father's legacy, for Thomas Wayne. But we also see where he's learning that maybe some of these charities and things may not be 100% clean. So the death of the father is very significant for both men. They do have a personal trauma that affects them very heavily. They both have wealth and education. I think John Rolling Ridge's story of not being impoverished, not having access to certain educations, is something we don't talk about more. I feel personally that anytime I look up a story about Indigenous people, when I look up any type of fictional or true story, it's rarely pushed on us that there's this significant amount of wealth or class or privilege that comes along with it. Um, so I think that's another one. I think that's a mistake. We do need to talk about more people like Ridge. They come with their goods and their bads, but Ridge at the time was very wealthy. He does lose his wealth once his father dies. And him and his mother and the family have to flee. Him and Bruce do have this higher form of education. At the time, Ridge was sent to New England, which had the best schools. So he was very well influenced with, Roman culture, German culture, Greek culture. He knew different languages, things like that. Another thing, of course, is the class and privilege. It's often said that John Rolling Ridge was lighter skinned because his mother was white. So here we also see again this biracial aspect that we could bring into Bruce Wayne. Of course, the philanthropy too. So despite Ridge's ideas of we have to assimilate, we have to be um, part of the American system or union, he was also, because there was a class of natives in California, they're referred to as diggers, usually because of their low status. They were often employed to dig many sites, which is where the name comes from. And he often thought they were taken advantage of. He also spent his amount of editorship talking about how they could be utilized in other ways, they could be educated, they could, we could help them out from being so impoverished and things like that. um so Ridge in a way did try to use his model for good. He did write many poems that he points to how we're not giving the Incas and the Mayas and Aztecs the same respects that we would give many of the other scholars and cultures, and things that way. So despite much of his writing about being, pro Democrat, he was very much trying to also use his voice to raise awareness about Indigenous issues. He was also one of the first people to write about the issues of Indigenous women of being kidnapped and forced to marry white men and then to produce children for them. And oftentimes they were also left behind. So if their husband died, they were often thrown out. Some had maybe 2 or 3 children with them. So he wrote much also about the plights of the Indigenous women that were happening. One of the first that was raising awareness about this. Another thing is their persona. So despite them being Bruce Wayne and John Rolling Ridge, they also have this identity of being Batman and Yellowbird. So Yellowbird was Ridge's Cherokee name. It's what the the life and adventures of Joaquin Murrieta was published under. Actually, the editor of that book was very much like, read this about, Cherokee person Yellowbird, and read it for the first time, and very much trying to make people read it because it was like, oh, surprising, a native person wrote it. So the same way that Bruce Wayne, and it depends on how you see it, right? Like Batman can either be the alternate persona or Bruce Wayne could be the alternate persona. The same thing can be said about Ridge, right? Ridge is the persona and Yellowbird is who he really was, or Yellowbird is the persona and Ridge is who he really was. So they both have this double identity, this really double consciousness and dichotomy that they wrestle with. And of course, the idea that Gotham City, despite it being about New York, can also represent the West in the way, because the West did have many different villains and many injustices and many people trying to take advantage of the system and poor people. We also have the same thing going with Gotham City. All right. Another aspect that I talk about is the trickster archetype. So depending on the tradition and the research or even the area that you're in, the trickster can be either a god, a human, maybe a different creature, or maybe a combination of sorts, some type of shapeshifter. Well, not a shapeshifter. I shouldn't have said that, but he can change forms. So sometimes he's like he could be a wolf, he could be a coyote, he could be a woman, he can turn into a deer, a tree. So he can be any combination of a god, a human, a creature of some kind. A shapeshifter is often used in the negative. That's usually a person who has delved into like witchcraft that can turn themselves into an alternate creature. So you might have heard other terms like a Wendigo, um, a skinwalker, things like that. This is not what we're looking at. The trickster archetype is something very different. This archetype focuses more on tricks and being cunning and just a little bit of mischief and chaos, trying to disrupt order, so to speak. They're also very difficult to kill, and many times they can't be killed, but they can be sent away. And so it's very much like we have Bats back here, right? He can use Bruce Wayne to trick somebody into going to a party. He can be very cunning. He is disrupting the order of certain mob bosses or certain Gotham City police officers. He's disrupting that. So the same way that we have this idea of Batman, we can almost say the same thing about Ridge. He's trying to be cunning, he's trying to be a little bit of mischief in order to stay in politics. And kind of because if you're saying well, we all need to assimilate, they're not looking at you, they're looking at the people that might be troublemakers. So they both Batman and Rich have this trickster archetype, and heavily the trickster archetype comes from indigeneity. I know people likes to bring in the Norse gods, but we're looking at the trickster more through the indigenous aspect. Another one here, let me move this just real fast, is the bat totem. So bat totems do exist. It's unusual, so let me try to see if I can help out with what a totem is. So certain groups or maybe an individual or maybe a family might have a totem. And a totem is a certain animals or a collection of animals that are designed to provide you some type of protection, some type of strength when you are weakness. Now bats are uncommon. Okay, they're very uncommon. Usually you might hear like birds or bears or turtles, something of the kind, but bat totems do exist. You have there's the one right here. So um Batman serves kind of as this totem, right? As a collective group, he is like the totem of Gotham, giving the city strength to fight back the injustices. He's also there to give them, you know, a morality boost. And the Bat also serves as an individual totem to Bruce Wayne. So in the comic book, when it eventually comes out of the origin story, um, you know, a bat flies through the window when Bruce Wayne is trying to think of this persona, and it frightens him and it scares him, and he says this is where he's gonna get the bat from, because it's a menacing figure. If you've watched Nolan's trilogy on Batman, he goes into explaining why bats are chosen, again with Bruce being scared, but then he also has the bat cave, so he finds the bat cave and creates kind of like this theme around it. um, but in this one with Matt Reeves, we don't look into we don't delve into any of the lore or the origin story or where it comes from. We completely skip over to year two, where we can see kind of Pattinson writing in his journal with a little voiceover, and he's like, this is what's happening. These are the good and bad, things like that. Now, what I found very interesting in my research is that a bat, and particularly a bat, having a bat totem, for strength, it means that there's some type of crisis within the immediate family or somewhere within the family. Um, so people who usually either gift a totem or find their own totem, um, the bat is mainly to represent the crisis. And if the crisis within the immediate family as a bat doesn't represent Bruce Wayne or even John Rowley Ridge, I don't know. Like, if you don't see that, I don't know how to make it any clearer. And another aspect that I do talk about for being part of the indigeneity is the animal spirit. So we looked at the bat totem, but we're also going to look at the bat as kind of an animal spirit here. So an animal spirit is a guide. And again, this is depending on your tradition, depending on um, where you grew up, what stories you've heard, of where you're reaching at. But the animal spirit is like a guide who's there to kind of give you inspiration, kind of to lead you in a certain way, in any number of ways. And kind of the way that we see this throughout the comic is the bat symbol, right? This is where it calls to Batman saying, like, we're ready, we need this guidance, we need this help, we need this support, so to speak. But also we do see it in the Batman particularly, um at the beginning, where he's like, this is not only a symbol of fear, but this tells the bad guys, hey, you need to kind of stop what you're doing. So in there we see some folks acting up, trying to rob people and beat people up, and then they see the bat signal and it kind of stops. So it also serves as an animal spirit guide to Gotham and elsewhere, and it can be something very temporal, which is what the light does. It also affects many different other ways, which we don't see through this film, but in other films and comics, you might have dreams about bats, and things of that nature. So while these are the three things that show a little bit about how it could be connected to indigeneity, one, John Rolling Ridge, the bat totem, the animal spirit. I feel like I just talked about it and I forgot about it. So the way that it's saying that, can Batman be part of indigenous literature or anything of like, yes, because we have John Rolling Ridge as a strong similarity, a strong likeness of Batman. We have the trickster archetype, we have the bat totem, we have the animal spirit. Now I'm going to talk about some things that might be problematic or might be something that we're going to have to look into a little bit more. So the Wayne family name. While while we talked a little bit about Katie Kane and how Katie Kane being Batwoman, and her being also Bruce's cousin on his mother's side could show that he was part Jewish. Bob Kane and Bill Finger really worked on trying to find a name that displayed colonialism and whiteness. I know I put whiteness in here. So if you went and saw Wayne Enterprises in China or Africa, you're like, they came and colonized this place. Like, that was their intent on being here. And it was really for the reason of the anti-Semitic laws. While their names were also important, it was very important that their enterprises, their corporation, like who this person was, did not display anything of Judaism whatsoever. So they were really looking for that, because producers could come and shut that down, right? Because there were so many laws that said, oh, this, Bruce Kane reminds me too much of being Jewish, we can stop this right here, and things like that. So the way that we can see why they chose this, we can also come in and kind of do with this Wednesday Addams, like, there's still a way that there's still a way that Latinx and indigenous people can be a part of this story, despite the name of them wanting to do with Wayne Enterprises, or wanting, them to be like this big founding fathers of Gotham City, because any of the founding fathers, we had fathers before you. There was people already here. You can't discover something that somebody's living on. So there's always that aspect that we can hit on. Now, this also demonstrates to why Martha and Thomas Wayne would be very cautious about wanting to release this information, or why they would want to silence anybody who had this information. So going back to the plot of the Batman, with Matt Reeves, so here we know, okay, the reporter has something. What if the reporter does have this information? Well, because their family name is so important, because their connections to colonialism and their wealth is very important, they could want to keep it silenced. So finding out that Batman's indigenous or Latinx or Jewish could cause Thomas Wayne to want to have a reporter killed. Because we don't have Thomas's perspective. We have Falcone's and we have Alfred's perspective on what happened. We don't have Thomas's perspective yet. I don't know if it'll come up. So if it's not there, right, we're gonna talk about it. We're gonna insert it. So there is always that possibility that Thomas wanted to keep this quiet as well. Okay. Another thing, let me move my face to the other side so that we can kind of see everything here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the villain. So usually within movies or anything like that, indigenous people or Latinx people are stereotypically the villain, right? We are the villains of the tale, the story. And what's difficult about this film, while there's very color conscious, casting conscious decisions being made, a lot of the indigenous ideas that I am looking into can also apply. In a weird way, Matt Reeves' script, everybody's an orphan, right? And they all have this different story of the same concept. So we have Wayne, who's the main orphan, who's rich and he grows up in his mansion and he has all of these fancy toys and everything. We also see the same thing with Catwoman, right? So she came from a single mother. She finds out later that Falcone's her father. Spoiler alert there. Her father does kill her mother, and she does get sent to foster care, where she kind of learns how to be a cat burglar, so to speak. So in a way, she's representing female orphans, in that regard. And what I could say about the villain here, especially her, is that she is a representation of the missing and murdered indigenous women. She is fighting to try to find her girlfriend. I'm gonna say girlfriend. I know I know everybody's like, it's her friend, it's her roommate. No. I when women say baby, it's either to a lover or to like a little sister. Annika is not a little sister whatsoever. So I'm like, this is her girlfriend. The moment she finds her, when she freezes and she can't do anything, and then she wants immediate revenge. It's revenge for her girlfriend. So it's another casting decision, that we have a first either lesbian or bi Catwoman. Now many of the interactions that she has with Bruce, I know people are like, that's very flirty or that's very this. It's also representative, but I think, because especially the way that Zoe Kravitz does it, like she has this like monotone voice, she's very into the moment, and then when she's dealing with Batman, her voice gets higher. She starts, she speaks from her chest instead of here. She starts using more of her chest comes out. She's very like very sensual, and I think that is representation of unfortunately sexual trauma. sexual trauma of an orphan, probably being in foster care, and things like that. So here is definitely where we can bring up the idea that she also represents this. She also represents because Native women are in a group that are higher, that have a higher abuse rate for sexual abuse, that have a higher rate of being raped and have a higher rate of being murdered. It's 10 times the national average. I mean, it is an international crisis that is happening. And I think even though she's the villain, quote unquote, the villain, she's not the good guy, she does represent this idea of indigeneity, which is something else that I would have pointed out with literary eugenics, is that we've missed that as well. We've missed that point in looking at it, because if Bruce is also, if all of these are orphans in the same orbit with the different stories, right? But they all have these parallelisms, and Bruce is indigenous, well then so is she. Um and she brings to light this aspect that he didn't even realize, like what happens when you don't have money, like what happens when you are a woman and you can't, use brute strength to handle something. She has to handle men, especially men that are taller and bigger than her, in a different way. I also want to point out with these casting directors, Annika could have very well been a brown person, right? She could have been from Mexico. She could have been from, Latin America, Colombia, and their decision to keep Annika as a white woman, I thought was very good. They're like, we're not going to place the stereotypes here whatsoever. So I just wanted to point that out. And the Riddler, again, him being our main central villain, he can also shows it displays an aspect of indigeneity and the horrors that were faced on being an indigenous person, right? Again, at the orphanage that he describes, right? He says it was so cold that babies froze to death. You could have gotten frostbite. He's like, rats were practically eating us alive. We didn't have enough beds or blankets or even food. And then they were forced to go to church. And I'm like, this is indigenous residential schooling. This was the process of kill the Indian and save the man. And again, also being a parallelism of Bruce is that if Bruce did not have money, he would have gone to the state orphanage where he would have experienced this too, which is why Riddler has this fixation of wanting to kind of get back at Bruce, because he's like, we all could have been you, but none of us were. So I'm like, yeah, Paul Dano did a good job, but him standing there singing Ave Maria over and over and over again, I'm like, is not part of his story. It's part of the religion that was pushed on them through missionary work, through the Catholic nuns and priests, and many of the religious traumas that were experienced by Native people. Again, this is a story that without literary eugenics, we would not be able to draw those conclusions, because we're like, what's this saying about this Irish guy who wears a mask? So in a way, the Riddler would make more sense to me if he was also an indigenous person, um, showing again off this parallelism that for every John Rolling Ridge, there is also more out here that are not being a part of that story, that are not being told or demonstrated correctly. Now, yes, it's a stereotype to say, well, we identify with the villains or we're part of this villainous tale or anything, but it's also important to say this works. Like you can put this not only on the main character but onto the villain. The reason I'm focusing on the main character, I'm focusing on Bruce Wayne, is exactly for the last reason we talked about, the Wayne family name, right? It's saying, hey, producers, directors, writers, let's stop being about the villains and let's start being the main characters. Okay. But I did want to point out that all of the villains in Matt Reeves' tale can basically be part of this. So this should have, now I'm looking at this, should have probably been a part of the slide probably earlier in about eugenics. So while eugenics, we mostly look at it through like a deconstruction of people. So eugenics happens by trying to sterilize them and eliminating the genes. This is something that Ridge was mentions many times in his essays. And again, it's also part of this eugenic aspects of we're going to create the fittest of the fittest by putting people and certain traits together that will make the desirable appearance or make the desirable trait. So the example here is arranged marriages, right? So Martha Wayne could have been arranged to marry Thomas Wayne in order that Bruce Wayne would come out looking not indigenous, not as a dark-skinned person, would have had lighter eyes, skincare, hair color, for that particular reason. So this should have probably been earlier that came out, but this is something that Ridge was also a supporter in. So despite me saying that eugenics has taken over how we tell stories and how we do this, we can also see how it impacted people in the day to day. Eugenics was not something that somebody mentioned once and was never brought up again. This was very much a part of politics, the way that we would talk about, kind of the situation at the border, or how we would, talk about like a hurricane or anything. This was very much a part of much of the politics. Rich does have a few essays that you can go look this up on. Um, what I am saying is that eugenics reached us, reached my generation and younger than me, to a point that we don't even know these events are happening anymore because we're not talking about them. We can't see the fact that three characters, if not more, in Matt Reeves, the Batman, could be part of this eugenic process. That the story, how the story was pushed on us, how we view the story, it demonstrates that and to me, it's like eugenics did its job. Eugenics did the job that it was supposed to do by removing any of the features of being, dark skinned, dark haired, dark eyed, to the point where, like the Pokeball, we pulled it back, but we started here with John Rolling Ridge, we moved to Joaquin Murrieta, we moved to Zorro, and then we moved to Batman. So if we look at it reverse that way, we can see how everything's been kind of like lightened, so to speak, into the events that we have quickly unfolded. To the point that if anybody looked at Matt Reeves' story, they would be like, I don't know how eugenics, I don't know how we're talking about it. I don't know how it's connected whatsoever to this Batman story. Like, what is this lady talking about? But eugenics did the job that it was supposed to. And so this is one of the many examples that I use to explain this. What I should have done that I didn't do was show you my sources. So that was my conclusion. Everything, my little rant and rave was part of my conclusion. So here's just a little bit of the sources that I used on Batman, as well as boarding schools, as well as looking at rhetoric, eugenics rhetoric, and things like that. Information about Joaquin Murrieta. So we have all of this here for you to take a look at as well. So forgive me, this is probably one of the longest videos that I have so far, but that is the idea. I usually use pop culture as a main example on how eugenics works, merely because if I told you we're going to talk about Batman and eugenics, you'd be like, how does that connect? Well, this is how it connects. It connects to a point that we can't even think about it. Like, we live and breathe it. We wake up imagining about this in a way I mean, it did its job, and now we need to kind of reverse it a little bit. And so the next part of my series will be about Brown misfit pedagogy and how the pedagogy can be used to show this reversal, how we can kind of piece and peel back the layers to get to where we need to go. But I mean, we're pulling back hundreds of years. You know, we're going back to like 1886 and saying our governments are, you know, when they're during the Civil War, they were writing about how eugenics and arranged marriages and all of this other stuff could have this impact. And it came to play heavily within the 20th century. And there's many examples of how that was that we don't even have to see or look at. So this is, like I said, I will stop talking pretty soon, but thank you for bearing with me. Thank you for following along. Again, any questions, comments, concerns, any suggestions on future comics, on you know how we can kind of tear future other future comics apart, just let me know, and I'd be happy to do so for you. All right, well, I hope you have a good one. Bye.